Sorry. Hello, my friends. Welcome to my channel one more time. Today, we're going to watch a little bit of the afternoon for the Chad trial, Chad Daybell's trial, who is being accused of triple homicide. He is facing trial for the death of JJ, Tylee, and his former wife, Tammy. Now, Chad has a lot of traits of a psychopath, okay? And this channel, I like to explore a little bit of that, the psychology side of things that we can't really explain, right? So, psychopathy is a very interesting subject to me, and I've read a couple of books about it. I've had an experience with a person with narcissistic personality disorder, which is someone who actually does not have any empathy or the ability to feel empathy or compassion for others. Maybe they even thrive in the suffering and the pain and the frustration of others. Okay. So that is not a just to have a narcissistic trait. The personality disorder is a different level. And psychopathy is not a diagnosis. It is encompassed in the antisocial personality disorder nowadays. And some of the traits that we are going to discuss that Chad has shown us, okay, is the lies, exaggeration, and dishonesty. Think about meeting someone at church who's extremely devoted, who has a whole family in the church that is like exemplary in terms of pursuing the message and the spreading of the gospel. And he tells people that he has dreams, visions, and he just starts to go a little bit beyond. And then he goes, beyond. And then he goes like way beyond, and people are not sure what's going on, but some people truly believe him and start following this guy as he is some type of prophet. Just interesting enough, all his prophecies include things that benefit him and anybody who is against him and his dream, his plans for his life, which were very selfish, by the way. Um, they are zombies. They are bad people. They are evil people, and they need to be dealt with. And you know what happens to the evil people? Their bodies die. Correct. So he does these castings and he tells people to do spiritual castings to cast out the evil, but the body is going to die. So this is how a little bit he got implicated into all of this. Um, does he lie? Does he exaggerate? Is he dishonest? Yes. Even when the cops were there in a very material way, material fact, the cops went to check on the kids because their grandparents were worried about them with rumors that they had not been seen. So the cops went to do a wellness check and they saw Chad and Alex, who was Lori's brother, and they say, "Hey, where are the kids? Or where's Lori?" And Chad lied right there to the police, right? Chad said, "Oh, I think they are with the grandparents." That's not possible because the grandparents sent us here. Also, I think that I don't know, with a friend. And then they said, "Can I have Laura's number?" And he's like, "I don't have Laura's number. We just met a couple of weeks ago." They were married and the police knew about it. So, yes, they definitely do exaggerate and lie, and they are dishonest, lack of accountability, and playing the blame game. This is the perfect example. The current trial, Chad is allowing his attorney, right, to put all the blame to Lori and maybe even Melanie Gibbs. Interesting, right? What do we think about Melanie? I'll give you a earful when we're gonna watch her testimony. That was so frustrating for me to watch because she's so frustrating to listen to. But anyways, so when Chad's attorney speaks, of course he's speaking on behalf of his clients, and this whole case, the whole defense that they have is to say that Lori, Alex, and Melanie all conspired on all the deaths that are involved in this case. And Chad is just a saint, and he was just manipulated by Lori's beauty, and he couldn't resist. Need for power, control, and dominance. This is another trait of a psychopath. And Chad shows the need for control, power, and dominance just by the way he manipulates people, by the way he would tell Lori to tell somebody else, right? He would never be the one telling them, but he would tell Lori to tell somebody else, listen, I know this person is evil. I gave them an evil score of like 500 and they're zombies. So that way, he would control and manipulate people. And the way he would control, manipulate Lori was exactly that. Like, even when she was like not giving him much attention and just spending some time away, he would text her things like, "Oh, Lori, I want to respect your space, but I saw some angels who told me they were very upset that you were away from me. And you know our mission is to be together. So I can tell the angels to please respect you. But if you don't come back to me, maybe they won't be able to protect you." So that is a very manipulative things to do. And that is proof. It's in the text messages that we are able to watch during this trial. Now, there are many other signs of psychopathy that Chad has shown us so far. And it is very unfortunate that we have these people in the world that cause so much pain and to the worst point, right? To the worst possible outcome to sacrifice other people's lives. Yesterday, disgustingly, we found out from Tammy's cousin that at his wife's funeral, at Tammy Daybell's funeral, Chad had the audacity to go up there and speak ill of his own wife in front of his family, his kids, the church members. He said that she was lazy and depressed and difficult to live with. Who does that at the funeral? Like, someone with no compassion, no empathy, and no common sense either, because the brain of the psychopath is wired differently and it doesn't have the emotions lit up that normal people do, like pain, compassion, empathy. I feel for you, you feel for me. I think that at that moment he just went off, not realizing that that was a very unhuman thing to do, to say, to speak ill of his own wife at her funeral, to her family, to her friends, to the people who loved her. Absolutely appalling. So today we're going to start watching this morning's court, and we're going to see what happened. We're going to watch it in um 1.75. I'll try the speed so that we can get caught up. And then eventually, when the trial comes back on, we're going to watch it live. I have it open here, so don't worry. When it comes back, we can go there and see. So let's get this started. And here we go. Bring in the jury. Bring the jury. Bring the jury.
Please offer the count for your honor. Thank you. Please be seated.
Chop, chop, judge.
All right. Good morning, everyone. We are back on the record on KCR 22-21-1623, State of Idaho versus Chad Guy Daybell. We're continuing with evidence in the state's case in chief. The state has witnesses to call today. The court will note that the jurors are all present and accounted for, properly seated. The court has received the juror affirmation from all 18 jurors. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, for continuing to follow the court's instruction each day when we break. At this time, then, I understand the state has its next witness to call. Who's going to be examining the witness?
I will be, Your Honor. The state will call Dr. Erik Christensen.
All right, you can go ahead and call your witness. I'll note also the defendant is present with counsel, so Dr. Christensen can be sworn once he arrives in the court.
And he is headed up.
Thank you. I'll just note one other quick thing on the record too. I did have a sidebar with counsel this morning just in terms of scheduling and planning. That was discussed off the record in terms of proposals for timing of witnesses and wrapping up the state's case in chief as well and when that may occur. So thank you for the information, counsel.
solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
All right, thank you. You can be seated here. Okay, thank you. Okay, now that the witness has been sworn, before we commence with testimony, I just want to inquire, because this case has been live streamed on the court's official channel, as well as other news media outlets, and open to the public. So, Dr. Christensen, there's an exclusionary order preventing witnesses from observing other trial testimony. Have you at all watched or observed any of the trial testimony since the case began?
No.
Okay, have you discussed with anyone else the testimony they've given at trial?
No.
Okay, thank you for affirming that. With that, Ms. Blake, you can inquire, and I will note with this particular witness, if we are getting into any kind of medical terms and testimony, please bear in mind that our court reporter is taking a record of everything said, so please speak slow enough that she can keep up, and she can go very fast, but sometimes it's tough with medical terminology. So, Ms. Blake, if you'd like to inquire, you may.
Thank you, Your Honor. Would you please state your name and spell it for the record?
Yes, Erik Christensen, E-R-I-K, last name C-H-R-I-S-T-E-N-S-E-N.
Are you currently employed?
I'm currently self-employed.
What position did you recently retire from a position?
Yes, I retired on April 1st as the chief medical examiner for the state of Utah.
How long had you held that position as a chief medical examiner?
I've been in that position since 2016, and I've been in the office there since 2008.
Prior to working there in Utah, had you worked at other medical examiners' offices?
Yes, I trained in forensic pathology in 2000 to 2001, and then was employed in that office for a year. And then I worked in South Carolina at the Greenville County Medical Examiner's office for 6 years before moving to Utah.
And what education do you have in order to be a forensic pathologist?
I have an undergraduate degree in philosophy from Brigham Young University. I have a medical degree from the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. And then I completed internship training in pediatrics at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, and then did 4 years of anatomic and clinical pathology training at Madigan Army Medical Center. And then after leaving the Army, completed a 1-year fellowship training program in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Richmond, Virginia.
Can you explain a little bit about what a pathologist is?
Sure. Pathology is a specialty of medicine, just like surgery or internal medicine or pediatrics. And it is primarily aimed at the diagnosis of diseases, disease conditions, abnormalities of the body by evaluation of fluids, cell samples, tissue samples.
So she's pretty much just laying the foundation, like, you know, are you a pathologist? What do they do? What is your experience? Like, are you qualified to be here? And then if John Pryor has anything against it, he can object. Otherwise, they're just going to take him as the expert. And I'm going to fast forward a little bit to see what the testimony is actually going to be regarding this specific case after his whole history. See, we had a case years ago, so I'm just going to fast forward this. Let me see what they're at here.
Negative autopsy. Can you explain what a negative autopsy is?
Yeah, essentially what I was just getting at, where we don't have findings, we don't have pathology, we don't have trauma that explains death. We have a essentially normal, a person with normal anatomy who has died.
That's interesting. Negative autopsy.
And so in this case, when we talk about it being a negative autopsy, is that because there was not a clear way to determine the cause of death right away?
Yes.
And you talked about one of the other potentials when you're dealing with a negative autopsy as being seizures. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about what a seizure is?
Sure. A seizure is a manifestation externally in some fashion of abnormal electrical discharges in the brain. That can be what you typically think of as a seizure, where someone goes stiff and collapses and then convulses. It can also, people can also have what are called partial seizures, where they may have movement of one part of their body, or they may have staring spells or the things of that nature as a result of seizure activity. But it's abnormal electrical changes in the brain that result in an abnormal behavior, usually associated with loss of consciousness, and also not under the person's control. They just happen.
Have you conducted autopsies before where there were signs that a seizure had occurred or there had been seizure activity?
Yes.
And where would those signs usually show up?
So there's a number of ways. Sometimes those signs show up in the body. Sometimes they show up in the medical records. There's a variety of ways that we have to evaluate the role of seizures in a death. From a historical standpoint, if somebody has a history of epilepsy, then obviously that can contribute. But looking at the person's body, the main things that we might see would be things that you would expect: trauma to the person's tongue, for example, and that can be recent or old. And then evidence of incontinence of either bowel or bladder. Those would be the primary two main physical findings that we might see. But certainly people with seizures are known to die suddenly and unexpectedly in the absence of having had a recent seizure. Having seizures, having a diagnosis of epilepsy puts you at risk for sudden death. And so it's not, certainly we don't have to have those things if someone has a well-established history to attribute their death to a seizure disorder or epilepsy. But in the absence of significant history and the absence of anatomic findings, we don't generally are not going to call a death as seizure related. And it's also not uncommon for people to have seizures as a terminal event. If, for example, you have a heart attack and your heart's not beating normally and your brain's not getting enough oxygen, you may seize. Or if you're diabetic and hypoglycemic, you may seize, but that's not because you have seizures. It's because of some other condition contributing to that.
During Tammy's autopsy, did you find any physical signs of seizure activity?
We did not.
And you reviewed Tammy's medical records, is that correct?
Yes.
Any signs of seizure activity in her medical records?
There's no mention.
In your experience, would it be uncommon for someone Tammy's age to have all of a sudden developed seizures?
It would be very unlikely.
And do you know how old she was?
49 at the time of her death.
Do you recall reviewing some information provided by Chad Daybell to the coroner? Or
I mean, it
deputy
was
about
super
Tammy having
young
seizures?
then.
I reviewed some records from the coroner, yes, that mentioned that he had said she had some shaking spells or fits or something. I don't recall the exact verbiage, but something that suggested that, yes.
Did you find anything to support that Tammy had seizures in your review of her medical records and or the autopsy?
No.
Lies, deceptions.
And I think you mentioned, I may say this wrong, but arrhythmia.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about what arrhythmia would be or arrhythmia irregularities?
Sure. Your heart, in addition to being a pump, is also a very electrically dependent organ. Your heart's normal pumping function is dependent on electrical impulses traveling in a normal way through the heart. And those electrical impulses happen the way they do because there are what are called ion channels that open and close and allow electrolytes to move through the heart and propagate those impulses. There are both inherited disorders of those channels as well as acquired things. Those channels can be impacted by certain medications and other things that put people at risk of sudden death by prolonging their what's called their QT interval. And so they having either of those, either something acquired because of medication or something that has been inherited, would put a person at risk of sudden death.
And when you looked at Tammy's heart, did you see anything that showed irregularities?
No. In those settings, most of the time the heart is going to look normal. And so we would, in any of those things, we would not expect to see anything abnormal with the heart grossly. Just to look at it, it would look normal. But we also would not expect to see, again, that type of condition manifest itself at her age without some other, if she had, certainly she could have it as an acquired condition at her age. If she had, for example, methadone is very commonly known to do that, but she didn't have any methadone in her system. There are a long list of other medications that can do that. Fluoxetine, which she was on, is also rarely been described as doing that, but she had been on a very stable dose for a very long time and with no indication that that had been a problem for her.
So similar to this sudden onset of seizures, you wouldn't expect to see the cardiac arrhythmia come into play with someone at 49 years old?
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. That's a bit leading.
Sustained.
Would you expect to see the cardiac arrhythmia come into play suddenly in someone 49 years old?
Judge, objection. Leading.
Same objection.
No.
Overruled.
And I believe one of the other things you talked about that could result in a negative autopsy would be some kind of an intoxicant.
Yes.
A
Are there
methadone.
sometimes signs during the autopsy that you're able to find showing that a death was caused by intoxicants?
There are things that suggest that. There are very few things that will allow that to be diagnosed at the time of autopsy. Most intoxication-related deaths at the time of the autopsy are initially certified as pending further investigation or pending toxicology results. Because there's just not anything that we see. One of the findings that is, though, very suggestive that we see not infrequently is what's called pulmonary edema, which is fluid buildup in the lungs. And it's a non-specific thing that can result from lots of causes. We see it in drowning cases. We see it in people with heart failure. But we certainly very commonly in our patient population see it in people that overdose, especially on opiates.
When we talk about intoxicants, does that also include poisons?
Yes.
You talked about a lot of times it
Ooh.
will be pending some additional testing if an intoxicant is suspected. Did you do some additional testing in this case?
Yes, we did.
And can you talk a little bit about let me back up. Where exactly do you obtain samples on someone that's been embalmed to have that testing done?
So as a rule, because someone is embalmed, part of that embalming process involves removing or at least diluting their blood with embalming fluid. So we generally don't have great blood samples to use. We will collect fluid from the vessels that generally would be a mixture of blood and embalming fluid to test if we wish. But we do our primary testing usually on a tissue sample in an embalmed person, usually liver, because liver provides the best postmortem reference samples for the most number of substances.
And were those samples obtained in Tammy's case?
Yes.
What is then done with those samples?
So we then send them to the lab for analysis. We request testing for a wide variety of analytes. In this case, we tested for hundreds of different prescription illicit and over-the-counter medications, as well as a large number of what are called novel psychoactive substances, which are some are illicit, some are not, but they're newer drugs that are being used illicitly. And we also did testing for heavy metals, did some testing for pesticides, did testing for some additional biologic toxins, plant-based toxins, and I think those are the primary things. But looked for all of those things in her samples.
Was there anything in the results that would explain her death?
No.
Was more than one agency involved in the testing?
Yes. So we had the majority of the testing was performed by National Medical Services Laboratory in Pennsylvania, which is a sort of the premier forensic toxicology lab in the country. We use them as a reference lab. They test about a third of our cases at the Utah Medical Examiner's Office. And then we also had some testing. They don't, for example, do testing for any of the plant-based toxins. They don't test for nerve agents and those kind of things. And we had those looked for specifically by the state's chemical and biological threat lab.
Would it be fair to say that this was pretty extensive toxicology testing?
Yes.
Was the reason for all the testing because it was a negative autopsy?
Yes, and driven certainly by that, as well as the circumstances surrounding her death.
And in your opinion, did the fact that Tammy was already embalmed inhibit the ability to test for those substances?
For the most part, it did not inhibit the ability to test. Some of the results we had to look at a different analyte because of potentially interfering substances from the embalming fluid. But for the most part, it did not interfere with that at all. And generally, it doesn't.
Was there anything at all from the toxicology testing that stood out to you?
I mean, the only significant positive result was the presence of her fluoxetine, which she had been prescribed for a number of years and was present at a non-toxic level. Beyond that, there were some, a minimal elevation of selenium, which is a heavy metal, also at a non-toxic level, but really nothing else that was significant.
And you had talked about sending out for that toxicology testing in part because of the circumstances surrounding her death, correct?
Yes.
Do you recall some of the circumstances that stood out to you?
I mean, specifically, we would probably do more extensive testing in any case where an exhumation is ordered because of potential criminal activity. So that would be the primary circumstance, if you will, that would drive that for us. Not really any necessarily specifics in this case, but because with an exhumation, you again, like most autopsies, you really only have one chance at getting what you want and being able to test what you need to. Having that be the reason that this person is coming to you is primarily the reason we would drive that. And in conjunction with them, we get to the end of the autopsy and don't have any specific cause of death identified.
And Your Honor, I'm going to ask if I can have State's Exhibit 295. I think there were several subparts with it.
Very well.
Fry's like, did you kill her? Tell me now, because he's like, well, maybe I did, but I didn't use that poison.
Your Honor, I'm going to ask for permission
All
to
right,
publish
good.
295E.
Guys, please disregard. Of course, it's
Never
not
said
true
like
what I
Yeah.
said. It's a joke. They are on 1.75 speed and still. Oh, did they go to sidebar? Okay, so let's see. Sidebar. Okay, and then they had a break.
Dr. Christensen, on that
Here you
photo,
go.
can you see something coming out of Tammy's mouth?
Yes.
Can you describe what we're seeing there?
Yes, this is foam, essentially. It's what a manifestation of pulmonary edema. You can see running down the left side of her face what looks like blood. Pulmonary edema fluid, as it comes up, is edema fluid is just fluid that leaks into the air spaces when it normally should be contained in blood vessels. And as it leaks into the air spaces, normally there is protein and other things within those air spaces to help keep them open. And as the fluid gets in there, it mixes with that protein and creates this bubbly, frothy fluid, which can then bubble up through the airway and out the nose or the mouth, or both.
Can there be several causes of pulmonary edema, or what ultimately causes that, or is it a result from?
Yes, pulmonary edema, again, I think I said previously, is a non-specific finding that can result from any kind of insult to the lungs. We certainly see it in asphyxial cases.
I
we see
already
it in
told
drowning
you
cases,
for
we
my
see it in the
last
setting of heart
email.
failure. We see it in the setting of drug intoxications. Those are probably the primary places where we see it, although really anything that causes respiratory failure can ultimately cause pulmonary edema to manifest in this way, pneumonias and other things.
Did the presence of the pulmonary edema also play into your findings in this matter?
Yes.
And we've talked about Utah being a medical examiner system. So you yourself or another medical or forensic pathologist will respond out to a death scene in Utah, generally speaking?
In cases where the pathologist will respond to scenes where there is a homicide or suspected homicide, or in any case where we're requested to by law enforcement at the scene or our other investigators at the scene.
Do you know in Utah if someone respond out on unattended deaths?
Yes.
And is that generally someone from your office, whether an investigator or otherwise?
Yes, it's one of our investigators in most cases.
If you had seen the pulmonary edema, is this a case in which you would have had an autopsy performed?
Given the amount of information that was provided at the scene, what was relayed to me is what was shared at the scene. There's not an adequate explanation or sufficient medical history to explain her death at her age in a sudden and unexpected way without doing an autopsy examination.
I think we've gone over this a little bit, but when you did the
Very
internal part of
interesting.
the
So he
autopsy,
would
did
do
you
an
notice- Was there
autopsy
anything out of the ordinary in relation to Tammy's organs?
because of her age.
Was there
Yes,
anything?
except for her lungs. Sorry.
And can you explain what was out of the ordinary with her lungs?
Her lungs were a little bit on the heavy side, heavier than would normally be expected.
Uh-oh.
and,
Nobody
had
likes
fluid
that
in,
because then
fluid
John
also
Fry is
was
going to
related
say,
to
oh,
her
she was
firearm
heavy. Her lungs were
firearm
heavy.
involvement.
Had you conducted other autopsies where pulmonary edema was present?
Yes.
Is pulmonary edema by itself actually a cause of death?
It's not.
Would it
Hmm.
be the result of the cause of death?
Yes, it certainly could be. So if someone has pulmonary edema because they drown, drowning would be that. If they have pulmonary edema because they have heart failure, because they've had multiple heart attacks, then the underlying cause of their heart attacks would be their cause of death. But all of those kinds of things, anything, lots of different things can result in pulmonary edema.
And is pulmonary edema generally a manifestation or finding associated with asphyxiation being the cause of death?
It certainly can be, yes.
And we've talked a little bit as well about your review of the external part of Tammy's body. Do you recall that?
Yes,
And you'd referenced the only external injuries you had seen were some bruises.
that's correct.
And Your Honor, I have what's been marked as State's Exhibit 179. If I can have counsel handed a copy, and I have a courtesy copy for Your Honor, then I would ask that the witness be handed a copy.
Very well.
And Your Honor, this exhibit is some blank diagrams. My intent is to have it handed to the witness and have him add some markings to it.
Very well.
May I have the witness handed a pen?
The exhibit's not yet admitted, Ms. Blake. And I understand because if it's going to be altered, just think of when that would take place if you're offering it.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Christensen, would you mark on that diagram where the bruising was located on Tammy Daybell's body?
Yes.
Thank you. And have you marked those based on your recollection of where you observed those injuries during the autopsy?
Yes.
And Your Honor, I would move for the admission of State's Exhibit 179.
All right. The exhibit now with the markings, I think it would be appropriate for defense counsel to see what the exhibit now looks like before I ask if there's any objection. All right, Ms. Bailiff, if you please submit that exhibit for reference to Mr. Pryor.
Your Honor, now that counsel's been shown a copy, I would move for the admission of State's Exhibit 179.
Okay, and I apologize, I lost track. Where is the exhibit at this point? Did you retrieve it?
I have it. Would Your Honor like to see it first?
No, that's fine. I'll ask at this point. Thank you, Ms. Blake. Is there any objection to exhibit 179 being?
If it's being offered for demonstrative purposes, Judge, I don't have an objection.
Okay, exhibit 179 will be admitted as a demonstrative exhibit. Ms. Blake, you may inquire.
And Your Honor, I would ask permission to publish.
You may publish.
Anterior right forearm, one over the anterior portion of the left biceps, two over the right triceps area on the back of the upper arm, and two on.
Your Honor, now that counsel's been shown a copy, I would.
Hey,
move for
sorry,
the
I had to
admission
go
of State's Exhibit
back
179.
so that
Okay,
we don't
and
miss what
I
he's
apologize, I
going to
lost track. Where is
say
the
from
exhibit at this point? Did you retrieve
the.
it?
I have it. Would Your Honor like to see it first?
No, that's
From
fine.
the
I'll ask at this point. Thank you, Ms. Blake. Is there an
exhibits.
objection to exhibit 179 being?
If it's being offered for demonstrative purposes, Judge, I don't have an objection.
Okay, exhibit 179 will be admitted as a demonstrative exhibit. Ms. Blake, you may inquire.
And Your Honor, I would ask permission to publish.
You may publish.
And Dr. Christensen, you can see on this exhibit, there's an R and an L that's been written in. Would you indicate what those represent?
Yes, those simply represent the right and left sides of the body, and at the bottom I also indicated which was the front and which was the back, although that's fairly obvious.
And then it appears that there have been several dots or markings added. Could you explain what those represent?
Yes, they are not to scale, but they are representations of the locations where we identified bruises.
And on the front, there appear to be 6 dots. Is that
Bruises.
correct?
Yes.
And then on the back of the body, 4 dots.
That's correct.
Bruises. All these little dots are bruises. Huh.
And you've already indicated they're not to scale, but can you talk about and put into the record where on the body these bruises were located?
Yes. There's
Okay.
one on the left upper chest, 3 over the anterior and lateral right biceps, 1 on the anterior right forearm, 1 over the anterior portion of the left biceps, 2 over the right triceps area on the back of the upper arm, and 2 on the back of the right forearm.
Friar's like,
you
oh
discover
my
any bruising on the
gosh,
lower
what am I
extremities?
gonna do with
We
this
did not.
client?
Did you discover any bruising around the head or facial area?
We did not.
Oh, what is?
And did you in fact take
Ugh.
photos of the bruises that were observed during the autopsy?
Yes.
You talked before
The
about the
subtle
difficulty
art
in determining the age of a bruise by simply looking
thinking
at
you're
it.
too
Is there
smart
something else
to
that
get
you did in
caught.
this case to try to determine how recent the bruises occurred?
Yes. As I mentioned, just the visual appearance doesn't necessarily indicate to us how old a bruise is, but we can at least attempt to narrow that down somewhat by looking at the tissue in the bruise under the microscope. Blunt injuries of the body undergo a relatively orderly progression, although certainly not very time specific in a to the minute or even to the hour sort of way. But initially, when there is an injury, you see just hemorrhage in the tissue. Then that will be followed some hours later. Can be as early as 2, might be as many as 12 or even 24 hours. You will then see inflammation start to enter the area to clean up the hemorrhage. And depending on the severity of it, you may then also see what are called macrophages that come in and start to clean up some of the broken down blood cells. You may see the formation of scar tissue if it's significant, and that goes through a progression from early what are called fibroblastic cells in the area, which are just the cells that make scar tissue, which then eventually become replaced by the scar tissue itself. And that allows us seeing what kind of changes are present in an injury can give us an indication whether this is recent, meaning minutes to hours old, whether it's hours to days old, or whether it's days to weeks or even longer old. But more specific than those sort of broad swaths of time, we can't narrow it down.
We talked about during the autopsy, photos were taken to document the injuries.
Yes.
Were photos also taken of examination done of the injuries?
Yes.
And Your Honor, I have what's been marked as State's Exhibit 178 A to Q. Counsel was provided a copy today.
The series of photographs, is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor. It's a series of photographs taken during the autopsy. And I believe the witness has been handled that jump drive. I would move for the admission of State's Exhibit 178 A to Q.
And there would be no objection by the defense to that exhibit, Judge.
Okay, so exhibit 178 A through Q, it's 178 is the exhibit, A through Q are individual photographs within the exhibit, and they're all admitted, Ms. Blake.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would ask to be handed that jump drive back. Your Honor, I will indicate these are graphic photos. I am going to be asking to publish them to the jury.
Very well. We'll have those published, and as I mentioned, we've had the monitors arranged so the public's not viewing those and they're not being streamed on the live stream.
Thank you. Yeah, I know some people want to see it, but I rather not. It's very private, and respectfully, we're gonna honor the memory of the victims. We don't need to watch that.
Dr. Christensen, do you see that image on your monitor?
I do.
Can you tell us what we're observing here?
This is the bruise that's on her left chest.
And in this image,
This is a closer up image of the same injury.
can you talk about, there's a little scale there. What is the purpose of putting that on the photo?
Just so we have a reference to the size of it when you get zoomed in, especially in a picture like this. It's sometimes you can't always tell exactly where you are or have a reference point to know what size something is. So we include a scale so we have a reference.
And in this photo, can you talk about what we're seeing?
This is an incision through that area of bruising.
And can you talk about why you did that in this particular case?
And with all of these, looking at the tissue, like I said, microscopically will give us some idea what they look like. So this is a prelude to having a sample to look at under the microscope. But it also confirms there are things, for example, certain dermatologic conditions and other things that can look like a bruise on the surface, but when you incise them, there's no evidence of hemorrhage in the tissue. So in this case, we can see that there is hemorrhage in the tissue.
And in this particular photo?
This is, again, a photo of the same area with the a tissue section removed that demonstrates the hemorrhage and placed into what we call a cassette. That little white plastic thing is that that tissue that is placed in there is then taken and processed and turned into a microscopic slide that I can review under the microscope.
Ms. Blake, on these, would you care to identify each by the sub-exhibit letter, if you don't mind?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
And the first one that was referenced of the chest is going to be 178A. The close-up of the chest is 178B. The first incision is 178C. And the most recent one that was referenced would be 178D with the slide showing an excision of the chest.
Thank you, Ms. Blake.
When you looked at this, what, if anything, did the, I think you used the term hemorrhage, what, if anything, did that tell you in relation to this bruise?
That it is a bruise. Just looking at it grossly doesn't necessarily tell us much, except that there is hemorrhage there. And then seeing it under the microscope gives us further information about that.
And then moving to 178E, can you, 178E, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photo?
Yes, this is an excision of tissue of the bruise of the left biceps.
And again, in those excisions, were you able to determine anything in relation to whether that was a bruise?
It was. Yes, there's hemorrhage within the subcutaneous fat. Normally, an excision of skin will just show a layer of normal pinkish tan skin on top, and all of the fat beneath it will be a bright yellow color, like is evident in most of those sections, but there are also darker areas indicative of hemorrhage.
And then on this slide, what are we seeing here?
This is a closer up image of the same injury and same excision.
Your Honor, we moved on to 178F. This is 178G. Can you tell us what we're seeing in this image?
This is a photograph of the two bruises on the back of the right upper arm.
And moving to 178H, can you tell us what we're seeing in this image?
Yes, this image depicts the three bruises on the right biceps as well as two on the right forearm.
And there are some other markings there, it looks like, on the forearm in addition to those blue marks. Do you know what those marks were?
Yes, those are areas where mold had grown and had been subsequently cleaned that off.
So those are not bruises.
They are not.
And then moving to 178J, can you tell us what we're seeing in this image?
This is a closer up image of the right biceps demonstrating the bruising there.
178K, can you tell us what we're seeing here?
Again, this is an excision of the tissue of the lower of the three injuries to the right biceps with the excised tissue in the cassette.
And what did that tell you when you took that excision?
Just shows us more hemorrhage in the tissues.
And did that indicate to you that those were in fact bruises?
Yes.
And 178L, can you tell us what we're seeing here?
I believe, actually I'm not positive looking at it.
So
whether that's the same as the
again,
last image.
if
And if I go
Tammy
back to the
just
last image,
died,
if that has
just
the
was
letter B
throwing
on
up,
that
and
white
then all
slide,
of a
does that help
sudden
in
she
reference?
died and she
So this is
rolled
just
out
a
of
close-up
bed
image
and
of,
she was dead,
178J, I believe, immediately prior to.
why does she have all these bruises in her body?
And when we look at this one, it appears that there's more
And
of that
who
dark
was next
coloration.
to
Can you
Tammy?
explain what that would indicate?
It's just that there's
Chad,
hemorrhage in a larger area of tissue.
the psycho.
Would that be indicative of a larger bruise or a deeper bruise, or could you tell?
I mean, it's clearly both deeper and larger in terms of the area that's damaged.
And moving on to 178M. Oops. Back to the right image here. Looking at 178M, what are we seeing here?
It's labeled L on my screen, I believe. It's the
Chad
right
and
forearm
his
with the
attorney
two
are
bruises.
like, okay, so why does she have all these bruises, man?
And going to the next one here, what are we seeing in this image?
This one is labeled M and is a close-up
Chad's
image of
like,
those
I
two
don't know, it
areas of
just
bruising.
appeared in the
And
middle
those are
of the
again on the right
night.
forearm.
Yes.
I had nothing to do with it. I'm a
And then moving
saint.
to 178N, can you tell us what we're seeing here?
This is an excision through one of those two bruises on the right forearm.
And what, if anything, did this excision tell you?
Again, confirms that it's a bruise, that there is hemorrhage in the skin and soft tissue.
Yeah, Chad.
then moving to
How are you going to
178P.
explain that? Did she bruise
This is an
herself?
image of a bruise on the anterior forearm.
Who are you going to blame?
Right
Who are you
forearm.
going to blame on? They're probably already talking about who are we going to
And then
blame
moving to
on.
178Q
Again, a closer up image of that same bruise on the anterior right forearm.
and 178. Oh, this is marked as 178. Oh, can you tell what we're looking at here?
Yes, this is the right forearm with an excision through that area of bruising.
And that was on the front of the forearm.
Yes.
And Dr. Christensen, were you able to make any kind of a determination as to when in time those bruises may have occurred?
They all showed evidence of hemorrhage in the tissue with no evidence of any sort of inflammatory response or cleanup response. So they would have occurred sometime from minutes to hours prior to her death.
And I think you indicated, but these would have occurred prior to her death. Is that correct?
Most likely. You certainly can bruise a deceased body, but generally speaking, that's not going to occur for a very protracted period of time once circulation stops. Mostly the types of blunt injuries that we see in people that have already passed are more things like lacerations, where a body might be dropped or something of that nature, but that certainly could have happened right around the time of death.
When you look at the location of those bruises in your training and experience, could they be consistent with someone being restrained?
They could be.
When you looked at Tammy's body, did you notice any signs of lividity?
Yes.
Could you explain to the jury a little bit about what lividity is?
Sure. There are a number of postmortem changes that the body undergoes after death, and lividity is one of them. It's also called livor mortis. It is cooling of the blood, which normally has been circulating through the body under pressure. Once that stops, gravity then takes over and kind of cools the blood in whatever is the most dependent portion of the body, the part closest to the ground. If a person is laying on their back, the areas where it is supported by whatever, a bed, the floor, a chair, whatever it might be, will not demonstrate lividity, but areas around that will fill with blood, and it makes initially a sort of a reddish purple color. That is where the blood is just cooling. It can change over time for a few hours. One of the ways we have to look at whether a body has been moved after death, for example. If once it's there and well established, usually by 12 hours or so, it won't change anymore, and it will stay in the position it was in, or that person was in, if they stayed in it for 12 hours. If they're moved prior to that time, then it can also move to where a new position. If someone dies, for example, on their back, stays there for a couple of hours and then is rolled to their front, that blood that had started to pool on their back will then start to pool to their front. And over a period of the next 10, 12 hours or so, depending on how long a person stays in their initial position, if you move them after 2 hours, more of that blood will redistribute than if you move them after 6 hours, than if you move them after 10 hours. And at some point, and at 12 hours is not a hard and fast thing, but at some point that lividity becomes fixed and will not change no matter what position they get moved to.
Where did you observe the lividity on Tammy's body?
It was all on her back, and because she'd been embalmed, it had changed somewhat in color. It was a little bit more gray in color, but the distribution was still very typical.
Just to clarify, does lividity allow you to determine a time of death?
It does not. No.
Can you talk a little bit about what rigor mortis is?
Sure. Rigor mortis is one of the other sort of 3 postmortem changes in the body. Lividity is one, rigor mortis is one, and then cooling of the body is the third. But rigor mortis is a stiffening of the body that happens after death. Initially, when a person dies, they will be flaccid or just completely floppy and not show any muscular resistance. But within an hour or 2, they start to become stiff. Initially, we see that in the smaller muscle groups, in the hands, in the face, and other places, but it will progress to involve all the muscles of the body, and will become, essentially very solid and very difficult to move after a period of hours. And then once it's fully developed, which is somewhere around 12 hours also, it will stay that way until the body starts to decompose. And then that will really can vary dramatically depending on where the person is. If they're in a cool environment, if they're in a hot environment, if they're next to a heater, all of those kind of things can change how fast decomposition ensues. But once a person becomes fully stiff from rigor mortis, they'll stay that way until they start to decompose.
Can you determine a time of death based on rigor mortis?
So we are asked pretty much usually only in the context of court testimony to discuss times of death or how long a person might have been dead.
I'm going to object at this point. This is becoming narrative, and I've tried to be patient, but the question called for a yes or no, and we got this narrative. So
Trying to be patient,
Dr.
Judge.
Christensen, can you explain how
But
rigor
this
mortis would
freaking
play
doctor
in or
is
not play
pissing
into
me
determining the time of
off.
death?
It can help us, depending on the degree that it is present or not present, to look at how long a person has been dead. But it's highly variable and imprecise.
And as a forensic pathologist, do you generally determine a specific time of death?
No.
Does the presence of rigor mortis allow you to narrow a time window of when someone may have passed away?
To some extent, yes.
In this case, did you learn what time Tammy's death was reported?
Excuse me, yes. My recollection, it was sometime just prior to 6 in the morning.
Had you learned or heard the description with regard to the condition of Tammy's body?
My recollection is that she was described as being cold and stiff or cool and stiff. I don't remember which, but at the time she was found.
Based on that description, would it indicate to you that rigor mortis had set in?
Yes.
You were not present on the day of Tammy's death, is that correct?
I was not.
You did not, is it fair to say you did not get the benefit of viewing her body just after the death was reported?
That's fair, yes.
So as a medical examiner and or forensic pathologist, do you rely on external information that's provided?
Yes.
Does that external information assist in your forming an expert opinion regarding a reference to when the person may have died?
Yes.
And in this case, did you in fact gain that external information?
Yes.
And were you able to come up with any kind of an estimate regarding a time of death in relation to Tammy?
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. It calls for speculation. His previous testimony confirms that. It would just be purely speculative for him to.
And Your Honor, if I may respond.
Respond, please.
He's an expert providing an expert opinion. He's already said he reviewed documents, he gathered information, he made a determination that rigor mortis would have set in given the description and
He's
information
allowed to
provided to him.
answer
So he's
that.
basing it off the information and forming an expert opinion.
Overruled.
And
Sit
in
down.
response, Judge, he wasn't present at the time. He didn't observe those factors himself. He's relying on what the police have told him. And at this point, he can't make that estimation.
All right, I've considered the objection. I'm going to overrule the objection, finding it's
Overruled.
proper in the form of an expert testimony would be subject to cross. So you can proceed with the
Sit
question again, Ms. Blake.
down, Mr.
Thank you. Based on the
Fryer.
information provided to you and your experience, did you form any opinion in relation to a time of death or a time window in relation to Tammy's death?
Yes.
And what did you determine?
That she had likely been dead for at least an hour or 2 for her body to be described as stiff, but it certainly could be much more than that, many hours. But it's unlikely to have been more recent than an hour.
And you did review medical records in relation to this case, is that correct?
I did, yes.
Would someone having anemia or past history explain a sudden death?
It would depend on the degree and the severity of anemia, but if it's not a current problem, no.
Would someone using essential oils or treating themselves with items bought at a health food store generally explain a sudden death?
I love essential oils.
And we talked about those bruises and saw images of them. Did those bruises and their location play into your findings in this case?
Yes.
And again, in a negative autopsy, you looked at the other potential reasons or causes of death that could result in a negative autopsy. Is that correct?
Yes.
Based on your experience in training, did you find it to be likely that Tammy Daybell died of a seizure?
No.
Based on your training and experience, did you find it likely that Tammy Daybell died of a cardiorhythmia?
No.
Based on your training and experience and lab results, did you find it likely that Tammy died of an intoxicant?
No.
And when we're talking about the negative autopsy, what did that leave as the cause of death?
Asphyxia.
Asphyxia. Whoa. And the bruises.
Your Honor, if I may have just a moment.
Yes.
Where's Chad's face? Where's his stupid face? Oh, he's writing notes to prior.
I have no further questions.
I had nothing to do with the bruises, and she was asphyxiated by herself. Oh, that is no good for Chad. That is no good. Let's see what Pryor's gonna do, but the testimony is definitely damning to Chad.
All right, Mr. Pryor, you can press. Can you turn on the microphone, please?
Let's do that again.
He's probably gonna come
Judge,
in
by
hot.
stipulation of the parties, I'll move for admission of Exhibit 102 and 103. That's Defense Exhibit 102 and 103 that represents the autopsy. And then the first one's a 26-page autopsy. 103 would contemplate the additional pictures and some analysis as well by this witness.
All right, the defense has moved for admission of Exhibit 102. Does the state have any objection to that being admitted?
Your Honor, it's my understanding that that is the autopsy report created by the Office of the Utah Medical Examiner. And if that's what it is, in addition to some lab results and other findings, the state has no objection.
Okay, so as I understand, there'd be no objection on 102 and 103. If and when those become published, if they are, Ms. Blake, if they're not what you anticipated, let me know and we'll quickly review that to make sure they are the exhibits you believe have been admitted. So those are admitted, Mr. Pryor.
Okay. And Doctor, you mentioned that you're retired as the chief, was it the chief medical examiner out of Utah?
Yes.
And that's out of Salt Lake City, is that right?
Taylorsville, but Salt Lake County, yes.
And I'm not familiar with Utah, so is that close to Salt Lake City?
Yes.
Okay. The government hub of the state of Utah, is that right? Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about the initial cause of death reported for Tammy Daybell, and it did say pulmonary edema. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you were able to confirm that through this autopsy as well, correct?
I was able to confirm through the autopsy that pulmonary edema was present, but
Right.
not that it was the cause of death.
Okay. Now, when we talk about pulmonary edema in this particular case, can you tell me how long would it have taken to produce the kind of pulmonary edema that you found during the autopsy?
I don't know.
There's no way to determine that.
No.
And there's also no way to determine whether it had advanced or whether it had declined. You exhumed Tammy Daybell's body, and you have to report the facts as you see the facts at the time upon the exhumation, right?
That's correct.
And at this point, you had initially indicated that you went in front of you didn't, but you were present when a hearing was held in front of a judge to make a determination as to whether or not they would have exhumed Tammy Daybell. Is that right?
That's correct.
And do you recall from your knowledge what was the reason for the exhuming the body at that time?
My recollection is it was to determine the cause of death.
Well, there had to have been some facts. You don't get to just dig somebody up.
Your Honor, counsel's testifying. Move to strike.
Sustained.
True.
There has to be a reason at the hearing to determine why you're exhuming.
Your Honor, counsel's still testifying.
Does it have it? Why
Isn't it
do
true, Doctor, that there
people
has to be a reason
exhume,
for
or why is there
The exhumation
hearing?
and not just be to re-examine findings. Is that correct?
Let's ask the proper
When you were
question.
present, what was the reason given for digging Tammy Daybell's body back up?
I don't recall specifically what was presented.
Okay, so what was the purpose of you going there if you don't remember why they dug her up?
Objection, Your Honor.
Whoa,
Argumentative.
whoa, whoa! What is the purpose of you going there if you have?
Do you recall whether or not there were discussions about surrounding circumstances that could have
What's
influenced the
the
decision to
use
exhume?
for you
I believe
anyway,
there were, yes.
doctor?
Okay, and those circumstances that they justified for exhuming were
You're no
the death
good
of Charles
for
Vallow, right?
whatever.
Objection, Your Honor. Counsel's testifying. The witness has said he doesn't recall.
The fact is those additional circumstances that
The
you based the
fact
reason for digging
is-
Tammy Daybell up out of the ground was because of the death of Charles Vallow.
Objection, Your Honor. Counsel's misstating. This witness was not the one that requested
He's
exhumation.
totally testifying.
Do you
Prior.
recall whether or not there was a discussion about the death of Charles Vallow at the exhumation hearing?
I do not.
Do you recall whether there was discussion of Brandon Boudreaux as a basis for the exhumation of Tammy Daybell's body?
I also do not know.
Okay, so you don't remember any reason, is that right, for why
Why
they
do
decided to
you
dig a body up out of the
exist?
ground?
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative, and it's asked and answered.
Exactly. Very.
You don't have
argumentative.
any explanation that you recall as to why they dug Tammy Daybell's body up out of the ground, do you?
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative, and asked and answered.
Overruled on that.
You don't have any,
Pryor, he gets the answer though.
I think I said previously, my understanding was to determine the cause of death.
but you don't specifically remember the factors as to why they dug her up, right? That were offered to a judge,
I don't remember the specifics of the discussion.
Oh,
and you don't. Now you talked a little bit about Utah, and from what I understand,
he
you
didn't
can do it
talk
by
about
request of the
that.
family. Is that right? Or you can do it by request of going in front of a judge and giving justifiable reasons as to why you would dig a body up out of the ground, right?
I believe that is the way the statute reads.
Right. And in this particular case, the family was never notified, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation and irrelevant.
Overruled if the witness has information he can answer. And I want to hear the answer.
To my knowledge, the family was not notified.
So in other words, then the other side of the statute is that you went in front of a judge, not you, but someone went in front of a judge and got an order to exhume her body. Is that right?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, even though you were present, you don't remember the facts that were presented as
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Oh, wait for the question. Wait for the
now you made a
question.
comment.
Wow,
your
he's
autopsy
definitely coming in
you
hot.
performed.
Very aggressive. That's not
and
good.
You noted that the bruises were what are called very non-specific bruises. You remember that?
I don't recall the specifics of how I described them in the report. I'd be happy to look at it and refresh my memory, but I don't. So bruises by nature are non-specific.
Okay. And you recall testifying last April and May in another proceeding in which you, in response to a question, I described the bruises as non-specific, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And when we're talking about non-specific bruises, what that means is isn't it true? What that means is that you can't identify the cause of those bruises. Is that correct?
A specific cause, no.
In fact, you can't tell how those bruises ended up on someone's body, correct?
That's correct.
All you can tell is that the nature of those bruises and whether they're bruises, right?
It doesn't
And I can
matter
offer
because it's
opinions on how
very
they might have been inflicted,
sus.
but there's a wide variety of those.
But in this particular case, you said they're non-specific, correct?
Even non-specific
Yeah,
bruising can have
but we
multiple
all
potential modes
can
of
tell
infliction, yes.
that
Okay. And in
Chad
this case,
was
you identified the
there.
bruises non-specific. We've established that,
Yes.
correct? And you can't tell me how those bruises were placed on the body of Tammy Daybell, correct?
I cannot.
Or how she got those bruises.
I cannot.
And the reality is we can go back as far as 24 hours, and those bruises could have been 24 hours old. Isn't that true?
Potentially,
Yeah,
yes.
but very
Or 12 hours
suspect.
true, right?
Yes.
And we can't even put a legitimate time as to when those bruises actually got, or she incurred those bruises on her body, correct?
Beyond the time frames. we've
Not a
spoken
good
about.
And
argument,
in addition,
Prior.
you didn't speak to any of the family members, the immediate family members, about these bruises on Tammy
Bruises.
Daybell, did you?
I did not.
No.
You didn't talk to the family about any medical history that Tammy may have had about treating herself for
Bruising?
bruises, did you?
I did not.
You didn't look at any of the reports or any of the
Oils?
medicine from the time of her arrest in which there was a notation about bruising cream that Tammy Daybell was using, did you?
Could you repeat that? I'm not
Did
sure
you,
what you mean.
did you see any
Notation or
medicine that indicated
bruising?
Tammy Daybell may have been treating her bruises with bruising cream?
She had a number of ointments, creams, oils, and other things at the residence, which those that were documented in photographs by the coroner, we did look up and go through.
Okay.
And so you, and based on history, in speaking with the family, you weren't able to get any information about whether or not Tammy Daybell was
So,
prone to bruising, correct?
was she
I did speak to
using
the family.
arnica? Arnica?
Did you look at
A
any other
bruising cream?
statements by Mr. Daybell while he talked about vomiting and fainting and falling over? Do you recall looking at those factors?
I did not see statements directly from him, but he was quoted as talking to various officers and others at the scene about those things. Yes.
And that leads into my next question, is that the information you got about what Tammy Daybell reported was given to you by police officers, not necessarily statements Mr. Daybell made. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So if we recap a little bit, we don't know why we dug Tammy Daybell up out of the ground, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Counsel's testifying misstates the evidence. And move
That
the
was a
strike.
question, actually.
We got an exhumation order to take Tammy Daybell out of the ground because you were there for that, right?
We did.
Okay. You don't recall the reasons why you got the exhumation?
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
So you talked a
She's
little
on
bit about
top of her
Utah,
game, though.
and then you talked a little bit about Idaho and how in Idaho it's up to a coroner to determine whether or not there's an autopsy that needs to be performed. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And in Utah, it may be a little different, right?
It is.
You talked a little bit about how it's not ideal to conduct an autopsy after embalming and burial. Would you agree with that?
It's certainly not ideal. Yes.
Right.
I agree with that.
And Judge, could I actually I need the exhibit, and I'll get the number, Judge. I'm sorry.
Well, don't be sorry now. You're kind of being very
I think it's
rude.
179.
I like John
republish
Pryor when
exhibit.
he's more polite.
Judge, I'd like to republish exhibit 179.
Because right now, if he tries to make a joke or make it light, it's not. Nothing that he's gonna
Just like
do
that,
is
right?
gonna take away how
So
he's
we're looking at
coming
exhibit
in.
179. You
So
recognize that. Those
aggressive.
are your dots, aren't they?
They are.
So when I look at that, how many bruises are on the right arm of Tammy Daybell?
8.
And there are 3 on the front, or 1 down at the bottom, right?
4 on the front and 4 on the back.
Okay. And then how many total bruises would be on the left arm?
1.
And then how many bruises up on the chest area?
1.
So you talked about asphyxiation, and you made a determination that there's asphyxiation here, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what you're suggesting is that Tammy Daybell was someone stopped her from breathing, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Chad.
So
That's
I
what he's
guess what I'm confused
suggesting.
about is how is someone asphyxiating Tammy Daybell if there's one person holding her arms?
Objection actually withdrawn.
Answer.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wasn't
Answer.
there, so I can't tell you the specifics.
I wasn't there.
And the other question is that
Were
if
you
someone was
there?
holding her arms down, how did bruises get on the front of the arm and on the back of the right arm?
You
Dude,
can have bruising on front and back.
that's a
from grab.
stupid question.
Okay.
He could have
And then that
bruised
person would also
her
at the same time be grabbing the
differently.
lower part of the right arm too at the same time?
Not necessarily at the same time. No.
Okay. And then while they're
Doesn't have to
asphyxiating
be
her,
at
they
the
grab
same time. All the
the,
bruises. There were bruises
the left arm,
everywhere.
and there's only one little bruise on the left arm, right?
There's 1 bruise on the left bicep. Yes.
And then
The
at the same time,
fact
somebody put
is
something
the
over her mouth while
bruises
they're
were
holding her arms
there.
to suffocate her, right?
It could have happened that way.
It could have, right? It's possible. It could also have happened that this wasn't asphyxiation, right?
I don't believe so. No.
Mm,
You're firm on this idea that you think it's asphyxiation, right?
on this
And that
idea.
determination you made is as a result of just talking to the police, and after you did this investigation, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Misstates the evidence.
Sustained.
Now, in terms of, we talked about this previously as well, but the bruising alone does not lead you to asphyxiation. Is that right?
It does not.
Okay. And the facts about other activities that may have been occurring, particularly Brandon Boudreaux and Charles Vallow, don't lead to asphyxiation either, right?
No.
Now, previously last year you testified, and there was some discussion about the 5 different levels of determination. Do you recall that?
I don't specifically know.
Oh, so you don't
Or
recall?
the 5 options? I'm sorry, the 5 options.
There are 5 manners of death. Yes.
Right. And I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong term. I apologize. I wrote the word down the wrong way. The
All
5
right.
determinations. And can you go over those with me again? Sure. Go ahead.
On a death certificate, there are essentially in every state except New York and I think New Jersey, and maybe Connecticut, there are 5 options for what the certifier of the death can list as the manner of death. Those are natural,
Okay.
Natural, accident, suicide, homicide, or undetermined, or could not be determined.
Okay. And I guess I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the undetermined one.
Okay.
And when you come up with an undetermined diagnosis, that means you don't have any reason that leads you to say this is absolutely the way this person passed away, correct?
Undetermined manner is used when you don't have enough circumstantial or investigative or autopsy findings, whatever. You don't have enough information to decide between two different manners. And that can be, for example, in an overdose, it could either be a suicide or it can be an accident. In this specific case, it could be, there's allegations of that her death is natural. If I believed it could be natural or it could be homicidal, then it could be undetermined because I can't really decide between those two, but I did decide between those two.
So that is a situation where if you don't have enough evidence to determine exactly why someone died, you make the determination of undetermined. Is that correct?
If you don't have enough, certainly if the cause of death is undetermined, then the manner of death will usually also be undetermined.
And that doesn't mean there was foul play. You just don't have the information to make that assessment. Would that be fair?
Yes.
So in other words, if in this situation there was insufficient evidence to determine a cause of death, it would be listed as undetermined, right?
The cause of death could be listed as undetermined. Yes.
And at that point, that's a situation, like I said before, where it doesn't mean that it's homicide. It doesn't mean that there was foul play. You just don't have enough information to make that decision. Would that be fair?
Yeah.
It would, yes,
Sure.
to an extent. It's possible that it doesn't mean that there's not foul play necessarily. Like if, for example, you call it undetermined because you think it might be a homicide or a suicide, and you can't decide between the two.
Mhm.
If you
Oh,
call it undetermined because you can't necessarily decide between those two, means you think it's just as likely that it was as it wasn't. I can't tell.
also
interesting.
It could be, but it might not be.
It could also be a situation where there's no medical information that leads you to any conclusion as to why someone passed away, right?
It could be.
Right. And there are situations where people pass away and there's no discernible reason why that happened. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Sure.
Now, you made mention of all the medical reports that you reviewed. Which medical reports did you review?
Reviewed records from Seasons Medical Clinic, from another clinic, whatever Seasons was before it was Seasons. I forget, it had a different name. She'd also been seen at a clinic in Utah before moving back to Idaho, and we looked at those as well.
And they were just quite frankly, those were just a matter of a couple of pages, right?
Not a lot of records, no.
Right. Well, a couple of pages, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative, asked and answered. Counsel's testifying. Move to strike.
Well, it was late. It's already answered, so overruled.
And you looked at the Seasons Medical and you looked at the other medical records and you were aware that 5 years prior to Tammy Daybell's death, she was diagnosed with anemia, right?
I believe so, yes.
And you didn't talk to the family of Tammy Daybell, is that right?
I did not.
And you were also aware that Tammy Daybell was taking a form of, and I don't want to, fluoxetine.
Fluoxetine. Mhm.
There's a reason I'm not a doctor.
Fluoxetine?
That's a form of Prozac, right?
Yes, it's a generic.
Oh,
And if fluoxetine
Prozac.
is mixed with the wrong kind of other medicine, whether it's herbs or supplements or anything else, those can have significant consequences, correct?
There can be certainly drug interactions with herbal stuff. I'm not aware of any specific ones of fluoxetine.
as part- I'm sorry, Mr. Ramsey. And as part of your analysis and the testing for poisons and all of the other testing that you did, you're not really able to test
Let me
for
be
the
very
herbals and the
nice
supplements and everything else and its interaction with fluoxetine to see if that had any impact, could you?
I think that's a two-part question. There's not really any way to test for drug interactions. You can test whether a drug is present or not, but certainly we don't have the ability to test for most herbal supplements.
And the fact that those herbal supplements, whether or not they could have an adverse impact with the fluoxetine that Tammy Daybell was taking, correct?
Don't have a way to determine that, right? Whether they were even present.
The heavy lungs.
I'm sorry, the heavy what?
Heavy lungs.
Oh,
Heavy
yes.
lungs. That's an unusual medical malady. Would you agree?
It's a
Sure.
non-specific finding.
Heavy lungs.
But it could have an
okay.
impact on the cause of death here, correct?
It could, yes.
Right. And you didn't take that into consideration before you made your asphyxia determination, right?
No, absolutely, we did.
No, you did?
Oh, you did. You didn't do anything. What's your purpose anyway? Why were you
testified
there
that
if you don't
asphyxia is
remember
really a diagnosis of
anything?
exclusion, correct?
It is.
So in other words, you look at all other possibilities.
Look who's
and if
here.
you can't find anything else, you go
Look
to asphyxia.
who's
Would that be fair?
here.
If you can't
Is
find
it
anything else
just
more likely,
trying to
yes.
live
Okay.
with this
But what
life?
is if you can't find anything else?
His
Why wouldn't you just go
life.
undetermined?
You might in some circumstances.
Okay.
Oh man, this guy, This
One of the
guy.
things I want to ask you
Now
about
I
are
see why
seizures.
some people don't like prior.
When a person has a seizure, it's not always a result of there being some sort of physical evidence to support that, is there?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, a seizure can occur at any time. Any one of us could have a seizure at any time. Would you agree with that?
Eh,
Could and is likely are very different things.
Okay. So are you at this point saying and excluding the fact that Tammy Daybell could have had a seizure as a possible cause of this death?
No, I can't 100% exclude it. I just think it's very unlikely.
You think it's unlikely? Okay.
Yes, very unlikely.
In spite of the fact that Chad Daybell talked about fainting and those types of issues, you're saying that because of that, it's very unlikely there could be a seizure, correct?
That's what I believe, yes.
Okay. And you're also saying, well, let me ask you this.
Nobody believes anything
um,
Chad says, though.
A
What?
seizure can happen at any time unannounced, correct?
It can.
Okay.
Mm,
Or there could be some instances where there's some medical proof to support a seizure, correct?
You can have a
Yes.
seizure, yes, because you have a tumor or an infection or other things, or you have a condition that leads to a seizure, yes.
Okay. And then we talk a little bit about arrhythmia. And with arrhythmia, there isn't always an indication with arrhythmia that there's there isn't always a damaged heart or a faulty valve as a result of arrhythmia. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
In fact, arrhythmia can happen at any time. Any one of us with healthy hearts could suddenly have an arrhythmia and die, correct?
Very unlikely.
Very unlikely?
Yes, very
Okay.
unlikely.
Well, does that very unlikely change when you look at the fact that Tammy Daybell's family history had a history of heart issues? Does that change the very unlikely to likely?
Not in the context of what her heart looked like.
Okay. And again, because her heart didn't look healthy or unhealthy, that isn't always the point, is it? Arrhythmia can occur even in the healthiest of hearts, correct?
Yes and no. Not in there is a reason that people have arrhythmias. It's not always apparent by looking at the heart. The heart certainly, as I discussed previously, can look normal, and you can have arrhythmias. But there will be something wrong with it, either microscopically evident or molecularly evident.
Okay. And molecularly evident means that there's some sort of syntax that hit the heart and it suddenly just stops working properly, right?
It would just, an arrhythmia just means no rhythm. And if your heart stops beating, you have no rhythm.
Right. And if the heart for some reason stops beating and there's some sort of arrhythmia, suddenly we get the pink foam that starts developing in these heavy lungs, right?
You certainly can, yes.
Right. And if we get a seizure, and as a result of the seizure, the heart stops beating, and then these heavy lungs start accumulating the significant amount of pink foam we found in Tammy Daybell's body, correct?
It can happen that way, yes.
And if the anemia goes undiagnosed for 5 years and she's not getting treatment, and for some reason there's insufficient oxygen to reach these heavy lungs, we could get the same result, correct?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Not given the activities that she was described as doing.
Not gonna agree with you, dude. You were very rude to me. Even if it makes sense, I don't think the pathologist is going to agree with John
What I
Pryor.
understood you were testifying to is there's really no definitive way to determine an accurate time of death. Would that be fair?
No way to determine a very specific time of death. A range, yes. A specific time, no.
Judge, I have nothing else. Thank you. All right.
Okay. What do we think about this?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Did John Pryor create enough doubts in his cross-examination? I don't think so, because for me, as a juror, that doesn't have anything to do, with the case. As of until yesterday, I actually didn't have any bias. I watched Lori's trial, so I knew a little bit about the story. But until I actually heard how Chad spoke ill of his wife at her funeral, I was like, all right, let's see what the evidence is, right? Let's show the evidence. And then when I heard the pathologist testify that asphyxiation could be a cause of death, and that he noticed she had bruises all over her body, I mean, John Pryor comes into the cross saying, oh, how is he going to hold her and asphyxiate her at the same time as producing all those bruises? That is a very silly question, because he could have obviously taped her mouth or whatever, then caused her harm or been bruising her for a week. He definitely seems to be someone who seeks control and who likes to, and who she was afraid of, because her cousin testified that she would act differently when he was home. She wouldn't feel comfortable enough to be herself, to do the things she wanted to do, to play video games or whatever. So why was she afraid of him? Maybe because he caused her bruises in the past. So the fact that she had bruises is very suspect. And the fact that John comes in with the cross, is that the best you got? Oh, he couldn't possibly asphyxiate her and cause the bruise at the same time. Sure. But maybe he just caused the bruises at one point and then he asphyxiated her at another time. So I don't think that any of John's questions were really that effective. Were really that, detrimental to the pathologist's testimony. But let's see if the prosecution has any more questions for this doctor.
Dr. Christensen, you were asked a lot about the exhumation order. Do you recall that?
I do.
You were not the one requesting that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
John asked him, why were you there?
You were
if you
also
don't
asked
remember
about
anything?
whether or not you spoke to Chad's kids, and you indicated no.
That's correct.
Did any of Chad's kids ever reach out to the office of the medical examiner?
They did not. To my knowledge. It's possible they might have, and I was not aware of it, but they didn't reach out and ask for me.
Did anyone ever pass on information that they reported to the office of the Utah medical examiner?
No.
So you reviewed documents you were provided from law enforcement, is that correct?
Yes.
And those documents contained statements provided by Chad Daybell?
They did.
There were no documents provided that had significant information from his kids, is that correct?
There were some about his kids, various interviews that have been conducted with their friends and things of that nature, but no, not from them directly, I don't believe.
So you don't know, you wouldn't know if the kids ever agreed to speak with law enforcement, is that correct?
I do not know.
And if Chad's kids had made statements about Tammy's health, would those have been documents that you would have requested or wanted to review?
Absolutely.
So if they weren't provided to you, would you have any reason to think that those exist?
No.
And you were asked about Utah being a little different than Idaho's system. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
Would you describe them as a little different?
I guess Utah's and Idaho's death investigation systems are kind of on the opposite poles of the spectrum in the U.S.
And I think we talked about this, but Idaho, a coroner does not have to have any medical training, correct?
That's correct.
Whereas a forensic pathologist or medical examiner goes through years of schooling. They're a doctor.
Leading, sustained.
You enter sustained on leading. Is that
Are
correct?
you a doctor?
It's
Because I think it's within the scope.
it's not outside the scope, correct?
Just for my next question, I wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, I only sustained as it being leading.
I think we talked before, but you have worked in systems where a coroner is used, correct? And in your experience, do coroners have to
Are
have any
you
medical
a
training?
doctor?
And to be a forensic pathologist, again, what training do you go through?
Have to have a college degree, a medical degree, then residency training in pathology, and then forensic fellowship training.
Exactly.
And in Utah, again, who is it that would determine if an autopsy is to be completed?
It would be done by the Office of the Medical Examiner,
So one of the individuals that has all that medical training?
either by them or one of our investigators. And if there are questions, then they ask us.
You were asked about the 5 different, I believe, manners that can be indicated.
That's correct.
Is it common practice for the Office of the Utah Medical Examiner to look at the surrounding facts in addition to what's concluded from the autopsy?
Yes.
And I think you talked about an example of a drug overdose, that there could be several manners, even if that's the cause.
Yes.
And you were asked about a history of anemia. Can you explain what anemia is?
Anemia is when your blood count, the percentage of your blood that's made up of red blood cells, drops below normal levels. Men have a slightly higher normal range than women, but they're both in the 35 to 50% range, more or less. That percentage of your blood is made up of red blood cells that carry oxygen around your body. You can develop anemia, which is a number lower than that for a variety of reasons. It can happen from vitamin deficiencies, can happen from iron deficiency, can happen from cancers, anything that infiltrates your bone marrow, can happen because you bleed. It's not uncommon in young women with heavy periods and things, for example, to end up being anemic because of blood loss. But it can be from traumatic blood loss as well. You can be acutely anemic because you got your arm broken and torn open in a car crash or something. All of those things can lead to anemia, but generally speaking, a progressive slow type of anemia, whether it's vitamin deficiency or something like that, is something that your body is able to compensate for to some extent, that you remain functional, though you might be fatigued or other things of that nature. But it's not, you don't have normal oxygen carrying capacity. And so if you went from living at sea level to the mountains, you might notice more of a difference than if you weren't anemic, things of that nature.
Sustained.
Is anemia treatable?
Yes, most times.
And I think you indicated you'd seen a history of Tammy having anemia maybe 5 years before her death.
I believe that's when it was documented, yes.
And if there were no other indications of anemia in her medical records, could that indicate that it was treated?
Overruled.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. We're not seeing any additional notations in medical records about anemia other than the past history. Could that indicate that the anemia was treated? And Your Honor, if I may respond.
Go ahead.
Dr. Christensen's testimony was he saw a notation of it from 5 years previous to that, and Mr. Pryor went into it on his cross-examination.
No, I'm going to rule on that. It's overruled, Mr. Pryor. You continue.
Could that indicate that the anemia was treated?
It could. It just means that it certainly was not mentioned again as a problem.
In looking at those medical records, do you recall seeing any indication that Tammy had low blood pressure?
Her blood pressure was on the lowish side of normal, but no indication that she had a diagnosis of hypotension or low blood pressure.
Could you use the microphone, please, Mr. Pryor?
Foundation judge, I'd like to know what report he's referencing where he saw that information.
And Your Honor, my question was just about the medical records that he reviewed in general.
All right, then he should be able to specify which medical record she's
All right,
talking about,
Mr.
Judge.
Pryor, this is not an objection. It's just an argument now. Is there an objection?
There is, Foundation.
All right. The objection is overruled.
In the medical reports you reviewed, you
The
didn't see any
judge's
sign
a
of low
little
blood pressure.
pissed off at Pryor.
In the medical records you
so-
reviewed, did you see any signs of seizures?
No.
In the medical reports you reviewed, did you see any indication that Tammy had a prior history of any negative drug interactions between her prescription medication and herbal remedies?
No.
I don't know what the problem is with the herbal
Counsel asked you about the
remedies.
bruises on Tammy and them being labeled as not
We all
specific.
should be
Do you recall that?
taking
Yes.
You
oils
indicated
and
that
teas
sometimes
and
you are able to form
all
an
that good
opinion as to
stuff.
how those may have been inflicted. Is that correct?
I can answer
Okay.
hypotheticals about how they may have been inflicted, yes.
And based on your training and experience, where those bruises were located, could they be consistent with someone being restrained?
They could be, yes.
Ooh.
And you were asked a lot about those pictures, and if someone was holding Tammy down and then suffocating her, do you recall that line of questioning?
Yes. Yes.
Where the bruises
Right.
were located, would it be possible for someone to have been restraining her while someone else suffocated her?
It's possible.
Wow. But that is not even where I would go with that. I would just
Based
say,
on your experience
would it be
and your
possible
read
to
and the
get
autopsy and
bruises
your review of
before?
documents, in your opinion, is it likely that Tammy died of a seizure?
No.
Based on your training,
Right.
experience, review of the records and autopsy,
As
is
a
it likely that
doctor.
Tammy Daybell died of a cardiac arrhythmia?
No.
Based on your experience, review of the documents and autopsy, is it likely Tammy Daybell died of a drug overdose or drug interaction?
No.
Based on your experience,
What is the
training,
cause
review
of death?
of reports on the autopsy, is it your opinion Tammy most likely or likely died of asphyxiation?
Yes.
And again,
Wow.
what did you determine the cause of death to be?
Asphyxia,
And what did you determine the manner of death to be?
homicide.
I have no further questions.
All right. Thank
What the hell? I didn't know that at all.
Cross
Judge,
on-
can we have a sidebar?
Yes.
Wow. I don't like the evidence, Judge. Can we get a sidebar? What the hell? The cause of death, homicide. I did not know that. I did not know that. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I thought it was ruled an accident, and that's how Chad just told everybody she died out of nowhere in bed, and that's what had happened. But the pathologist is telling us asphyxiation, homicide. So interesting, very detrimental testimony to the defense. Prior
All
asked
right, counsel,
for
after sidebar, the court's
sidebar.
determined I'll allow a recross on that one narrow scope
Oh,
of the
he
issue you want
wanted
to
to
discuss, Mr.
recross.
Pryor, with the witness.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
So, Doctor, we talked about two types of medical records. One was from Seasons. I believe that was 2017. Do you recall that?
There was a record from 2017, yes.
And then there was a medical record from 2019. Is that right?
There was. Mhm.
Okay. And those were the two records that you had in terms of Tammy Daybell's medical records, correct?
There were also records from PA Senna that she saw at Seasons. There was a record from 2016 as well as one from 2015.
And the anemia diagnosis was from what year?
I believe 2014, which was, I don't recall specifically which records that was in. We also had records from a clinic in Springville.
Okay. Is it possible that the anemia was from the Seasons records of 2017?
Possible. I don't recall for sure.
Okay. So from 2017, we have one other medical record where she went in for a wrist issue, correct? Correct. So how do you determine whether or not she's treated for anemia if there are no other medical records other than the initial diagnosis from 2017?
Objection, Your Honor, misstates the testimony.
There's no mention of treatment either way.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, that will conclude then the testimony. Dr. Christensen, is the state intending to recall him at some point
Ooh,
or any
that
point
was
this week?
Maybe, Your Honor.
spicy. That was
Dr.
hot.
Christensen, then, because you may return to testify at a later time, the court's exclusionary rule prohibits you from viewing trial testimony. I'll be asking you if you have viewed any of the testimony after
Counsel,
you step down today. So with that, that will conclude
Absolutely
the testimony of Dr.
interesting.
Christensen. You may
Very
go ahead.
Before he's excused,
interesting.
could we have another sidebar?
He wants to ask more questions. Absolutely fantastic testimony. Very damning to the defense. Again, really, like the pathologist who is a doctor who went to medical school, he's not just giving an opinion, he's giving his professional opinion, observing bruises in the body, observing how her
All right, after
body
the sidebar,
appeared.
counsel for the defense has correctly pointed out, and I agree that expert witnesses are not subject to the same exclusionary rules that normal lay witnesses are. So the state will discuss that further with you, Dr. Christensen. You may in fact be entitled to view certain parts of this trial as they would be outside of the exclusionary rules. So you'll be further advised of that by the
Yeah, he can
prosecutors if they wish
watch
to
the
clarify that with
trial.
you.
That's what they're
Thank you again for
saying.
preparing to testify, and we'll go ahead and let you step down at this time.
Cause of death, homicide. That's what we get from this testimony. Homicide. Who
All right, is
was
the
with
secretary call us next
Tammy when
witness?
she
Yes, Your Honor, the state
died?
will call Alice Gilbert.
Chad. Rest my case. Mic drop. Mic drop. Oh, sorry. Let me share this again. I forgot I had me very big. Oh, who's this guy?
Fair or affirm, the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Please.
Alice, they said.
All right, I'll note that Ms. Gilbert's now been placed under oath. Before we begin with testimony, I just want to inquire, have you watched any of this trial on either the live stream or here in person at all?
No.
Okay, have you talked to anybody else about any testimony they've given in trial?
No.
Okay, thank you for letting the court know that. Ms. Blake, you can inquire on direct.
Thank you, Your Honor. Would you please state your name and spell it for the record?
Alice Gilbert, ALICEGILBERT.
And Ms. Gilbert, do you know an individual named Chad Daybell?
I do.
How do you know him?
He was my neighbor, and when we moved into the neighborhood, we got to know him through our community and our ward.
Did you also know Tammy or Tamara Daybell?
I do.
And did you know her the same way?
Yes,
And what did you refer to her as, Tammy or Tamara?
I called her Tammy.
And when you moved into the neighborhood, do you recall approximately when that would have been?
It was March of 2017.
Even the neighbor sounds emotional.
And were the Daybells already living there?
Yes,
Did you get to know Tammy or Chad? Did you get to know one of them better than the other one?
Tammy. I got to know Tammy better.
And how did you end up getting to know Tammy?
We worked in the same church calling together, and so I got to know her through that. church calling.
Unbelievable.
And when you
Just
say
by
church
her
calling, what church
first
was that
words,
associated with?
The LDS Church.
you
And
could
what
tell
callings
that
did
she
the two
has
people
an
where you worked
affection
closely?
for
I
Tammy.
was the Relief Society president, and she was my first counselor.
How often do you think you saw Tammy?
We met once a week and on Sundays.
And did that seeing each other twice a week continue for an extended period of time?
Until her death,
And do you recall when the two of you were given the callings?
October of 2018.
So for about a year, you would see Tammy about twice a week.
Yes,
Did you get to know Tammy pretty well?
I thought so. I thought we did.
And can you describe, Tammy, a little bit your relationship with her? Let me back up. Can you describe a little bit about what Tammy was like?
Yes, she was great to work with. She was organized when we had our meetings. She could do work on the computer. So when we had to change anything, she could do it in Flash. She did all the computer work. When we organized activities, we valued her opinion and was grateful to have her input on things. And she would say, keep it simple, keep our activities simple. And we did, and that helped a lot.
Keep it
She had a lot of
simple,
empathy for some of the
stupid.
women who were struggling in the ward, and she would relate those things to us in our meetings. She also had very good wit with her.
Did you have occasions to observe Chad and Tammy together?
I did mostly at church, and they seemed great at church. You know, it was just normal. It was, you know, and we had activities. He would come and help set up some chairs
Hmm.
for activities, and so that seemed normal. And I really didn't think much of it.
At some point in
Okay.
time, did you feel like their interactions changed?
A little bit, yes. In 2019, it just seemed distant. It just seemed to be a distant between the two. But I just noticed them at church.
Did Tammy ever talk to you about her marriage?
She didn't. I think the only thing she did mention was that sometimes the finances were a little strained, but she didn't mention anything else.
When you observed Tammy, did you ever notice her appear to slow down?
No,
Did you ever notice any change in her activity level prior to her death?
no,
Did she ever complain to you about any health issues?
no,
Did you ever observe Tammy have any shaking fits?
no,
Did you ever observe Tammy faint?
no.
How did you learn about Tammy's death?
On the morning of the 19th, I received a phone call from Emma, and she was
Objection, Judge. This is going to call for some hearsay.
It's listening hearsay on that part, so that's sustained.
And just to clarify, when you say on the 19th, is that October 19th of 2019?
Yes,
And you indicated that Emma had phoned you. How did Emma seem when you talked to her?
she was sobbing.
And after that, based on that phone call, without saying what Emma said, did you learn anything in relation to Tammy?
That she had passed away.
Objection, Judge. Calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
At some point, did someone else take the phone?
Chad, he took the phone.
And what did Chad tell you?
He asked me not to tell anybody for about an hour that she had passed away. And I said, well, I need to tell the bishop. And he said, no, don't tell the bishop. And I knew that the bishop was he was going to work. And so I called him anyway and informed him.
And what you called to inform him was of Tammy's death?
Yes,
Were you surprised to hear of her passing?
yes.
And why were you surprised?
I had just talked to her on Wednesday and she was fine. She was excited. She had just gotten a new grandbaby. We had talked about Mark and his mission, and she had told us experiences of his mission, and she was excited with things.
On October 19th, after learning of her death, at some point, did you end up going to the Daybell residence?
Yes, my husband and I went over at about 8:30 in the morning, and Chad answered the door, and he gave us a hug, and we went in, and all the children, except for Mark and their spouses, were sitting there in the living room. They were stunned. The children were stunned. They could hardly speak and crying.
Did you end up making any observations of Chad when you arrived?
Yes, when I asked him what happened, and he said that Tammy vomited at midnight, and they think she passed away at 2 a.m., and that her legs were hanging over the bed, and that she'd fallen out of bed. He also said they think she died of an embolism.
And Chad provided all this information the morning of her death?
Yes.
How did Chad appear to you?
He wasn't as upset as the children. He was ready to tell us, and he wasn't as devastated as the children were.
And you indicated you'd just seen her the Wednesday before her death.
Yeah.
Did she complain to you at all that day of any health issues?
No, and I knew she was taking clogging lessons when we would have activity nights.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. It's going into a narrative.
You can answer.
I can answer. We had activity.
Sit
nights,
down,
which started at,
Prior.
I think 6:30. She would leave early, maybe 8 o'clock, because she was going to a clogging class. And so, in my mind, I think I'm going home to bed at 8 o'clock. She was going to a clogging class, so I admired her for doing that.
On Wednesday, when you saw her, did Tammy have a cough? that you noticed?
Same.
No,
Did she have any kind of a coughing fit around that time?
I didn't notice any.
After arriving at the Daybell residence, did you do something else that morning?
Yes, we had asked if they had breakfast, and they hadn't. So my husband and I said, well, we'll go get you breakfast. And as we stood up to go, Chad told us that her funeral was going to be on Tuesday and a memorial on Wednesday. And I was surprised. I said, well, did you plan this? And he said, no, but
Did you
I was
plan
surprised
this?
that fast that he could tell me that.
And
Like,
when
I'm
you asked if
ready.
he planned it. Why did you ask that?
Because I
Did
know
you
what it takes
plan her
to
death?
plan a
Oh,
funeral with a
the
ward and
funeral.
to organize the church and have the ladies in the ward provide the meal. And you need to ask the sisters to volunteer to provide meals. And it takes
Chad
time.
was
All of
ready
it takes
to
time. So I
go.
was really surprised that the
Chad
visit to her
was
funeral
ready
was in
to
Springfield.
go.
That also surprised me because we were there in Idaho,
And do you recall what day of the week October 19th was?
Saturday,
And the funeral was going to be on
Tuesday.
Yeah, that is pretty soon. Usually you have to go look
And
at
did Chad respond when you asked if he had already planned the funeral or if he and Tammy had talked about it before?
He said no, but
look at the
like
cemetery, the
it had been planned.
coffin, the flowers, get
Did
it
you
arranged.
end up attending the funeral?
yes, I needed to see her.
Oh, poor
So,
thing. Here we
we
go
spent the night at the
again.
funeral in Springfield.
Let's watch Chad's
to
reaction
see her
to
in the casket.
this.
And she looked nice in the casket.
Look at him. No
Did you ever talk to
emotion.
Chad about why he held the funeral in Springfield?
I didn't. I just assumed it was because they lived there before. So I didn't ask.
This is a good time for you to pretend to cry,
When you were at the
Chad.
funeral, do you recall making any observations of Chad?
When we viewed her before the funeral, and it was just him standing by the casket. It didn't seem really mournful.
Look at him. He's not mournful
him.
now.
He
We believe
said,
him.
I said, oh, she looks good. And he said,
We
yes, she
believe
does.
her.
And we didn't cry. We didn't, it didn't seem mournful. And then we went into the chapel to sit for the funeral. And
Look at John.
I said,
John's
"Father,
body
and
language just
Linda was
like
we sat with him."
scratching his head, like, what do
During
we
the funeral,
do?
do you
This
recall
guy
if Chad
doesn't even
spoke?
show remorse.
Yes, all the children spoke, and he spoke last. I was impressed with the children's talks that fast. They did a nice job to their mother. I was surprised because it takes a day to drive. So to go funeral on Tuesday, they would have driven Monday. They did the children did a nice job. And Chad spoke last. I was surprised because most spouses are too devastated to speak, and so I was surprised
Right.
that he spoke at her funeral, and it was last. And it was like a church talk. The other talks were more loving tributes to their mother. His was more church talk.
Huh.
And do you recall if there was a memorial service held?
It was held the next day in Idaho, but I did not attend because I had just been to her funeral.
Did you end up having a role or playing a part in taking a meal to Chad's family?
Yes, so our presidency and the bishop provided a meal for them after the memorial, and so we took it over to them after, and we had to put it down for them to eat, and the kids had started to eat, and Chad told us that he was moving out, that he couldn't be there, and that he was going to move to Rexburg to a condo, and we asked him, like, do you need help or anything? He said no, that his friend had a condo for him, that he wasn't there very often, so that he told him he could stay there.
And you said do you recall, did Chad refer to the friend as a he?
In I took it as that, and I'm thinking he said because he said he wasn't there very often, and so he could stay there.
So Tammy's pronounced dead on Saturday, correct? And by the following Wednesday, Chad's got plans to move out of the house.
Yes.
Do you recall anything else that morning standing out to you as far as what Chad told his kids?
He had told his kids to go through Tammy's things after he told us he was moving out, and that surprised me too. That's maybe I'm more sentimental, but it just seemed fast. And they kind of took it in stride, and I think they did do that.
Yes, dear. Of course, you're more
In the time
sentimental
just after
because
Tammy's
you
death,
have
did you have an
feelings.
opportunity to observe any of the Daybell children, so Chad and Tammy's children?
I went and saw Emma on Friday, and she was sobbing. She's really struggling, and she was getting really sick. She lost a lot of weight. We had organized meals for her. I know the school district was taking meals into her and Garth. She was struggling. She told me she missed
Judge,
her mother.
objection.
Grounds?
Hearsay.
Sustained.
Did Emma appear to be struggling to you?
Yes,
Did Garth appear to be struggling as well?
yes,
And on Friday, to the best of your knowledge, had Chad moved out of the residence?
yes. I think he moved after the memorial
So you visited with Garth and Emma just less than a week after their
on
mom.
Friday. Yeah.
I was on mute. So
Chad
Chad
there when you went to visit
continues to
No.
sit there emotionless, even when they're talking about his
And when you say the
kids.
house you went to, what house was Emma staying in at that time? Do you recall?
Yeah, she lived Keeney corner from Chad's house,
And do you know what house Garth was staying in?
and Garth was living in Chad's house.
At some point, did you end up reaching out to Chad?
Yeah, so we thought we would call and see how he was doing, and I think it was Saturday, the 26th of October. We called him to see if we could come and visit with him, and he said No, that he would come to our place. So he came, that's on the 26th, he came over to our place. I think it was more toward the evening when he came.
And Judge, for foundation purposes, that would have been the month of what and year?
Like, do you want to clarify when that happened, please?
When you talk about the 26th, are we still in October 2019?
Yes,
So just shortly after Tammy's passing.
yes.
And Chad indicated to you he didn't want you to come to his place, but he'd come to yours.
Yeah, he said, oh, I'll come over to your place. So we said, okay.
Did you ever end up seeing where Chad was living in Rexburg?
No.
And did he in fact end up coming to your place?
He did.
And did you end up having a conversation with him at that time?
Yes, he sat at our kitchen table and I had made cookies and thought, that, we would make it nice. And he said that he found the woman he was going to marry. And
Wow.
we were absolutely stunned when he said that. And we asked him, well, where did you meet her? And he said at the conference in St. George in 2018. And we asked who she was, and he wasn't going to tell us at first. And then he said, well, I'll tell you, her name is Lori Vallow.
Had you heard the name Lori Vallow before then?
I hadn't. I was thinking, who is Lori Vallow? And then he mentioned that she had done a podcast with Melanie Gibb. And then I realized that's who that was.
Had you ever met Melanie Gibb in person?
Not then. I hadn't met her in person.
And you'd never met Lori Vallow at that point?
No.
Sus.
And to the best of your recollection, this was around October 26th?
Yes.
So just 7 days after Tammy's passed away.
7 days.
Were you surprised to hear that Chad had already found someone else to marry?
Absolutely.
That is so incredible. It's ridiculous.
At some point, did you end up meeting
Look at his
Lori Vallow?
banana face.
Yes. While he was at our home, he said that she was in town. Would we like to meet her? We said yes.
And John Pryor's
Tuesday
like,
nights, my
well,
husband and I,
that's another
um,
grave I'm
and
digging
we're-
for
we're going to the
myself.
temple. We were in the temple on Tuesday nights. We were waiting in a room for a meeting to begin that following Tuesday. And he tapped us on the shoulder and had us step out in the hallway. And that's where we met Lori and
Like
her niece
here.
Melanie.
I know
and
you
friend. I
remember
can't
my
remember
dead
her.
wife, but look, I have a new
And that was your
one.
first time meeting Lori,
Yes,
and it was at the temple.
it was at the temple.
And Judge, could we have some foundation as to the date, time?
Your Honor, that's already been
Why?
discussed.
I must have missed it, Judge.
Why?
Go ahead, Ms. Blake.
Ms. Gilbert, at some point after that, did Chad and Lori end up coming to your house?
Yes. And it was in that week, and I think it was Friday from that Tuesday that he came over with her. And it was cold when they came in. I asked her if she was getting used to the cold, and she said she'd bought some warm clothes. And they sat on the couch. And it was awkward.
And when you say it was awkward, did you make observations of Chad and Lori's interactions?
Yes, they were very affectionate with each other, more than I had ever seen Chad. It was very affectionate with her, and they were giggling and laughing. And my husband and I were embarrassed.
Have you
Unbelievable.
ever seen
What
Chad walk away
a
with Tammy?
No,
what a psychopath to even bring this
Did you end up talking
lady
at that time to Lori about
to
her
his
family?
neighbor's house.
I did. I asked her if she'd been
Where-
married, and she said yes, that her husband had died in December of a heart attack. I asked her if she had children, and then Chad said that she had recently had a daughter that had passed. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. And I said, how many? And she said, thank you. And I said, how many children do you have? And she kind of stammered and said there were stepchildren, and I did not get a definite answer on that.
When
A
Chad
daughter
said
that
she
had
recently lost a daughter,
passed.
did Lori say anything to correct that or change it?
No,
I wonder if this is what was at the same time that they were
this
telling
would have occurred
everybody
end of
that
October,
they
beginning of
didn't
November
know where the
2019,
kids
is that correct?
were,
Yes.
or that when she was at the university, they said Tylee
You also
was at
talk
the
about, you asked
university.
Lori if she was getting used to the cold. Do you recall anything about that particular October?
yes, it was a very cold October. It was an early frost and a hard frost. So the farmers were getting the potatoes early. I used to work for an ag company, and so the importance of the potatoes not freezing. And not only that, they were helping each other to get their crops out early. So it was a cold October.
When Chad and Lori were there, did they talk to you and your husband about plans for a future together?
Yes, they had talked about getting married, but they didn't know when or where yet. They planned on taking the kids to Disneyland at Thanksgiving time.
And did Chad tell you anything about his plans to write a book?
Yes, he told us he was going to Hawaii to write a book.
And to get married.
But I didn't know they were going to live there. He just said he was planning on writing a book and going to Hawaii.
So Chad mentioned he was going to be going to Hawaii,
Mhm.
correct?
Yes.
And he and Lori also mentioned their plans to get married to you.
Judge, there's been some leading here.
Sustained.
There has been some leading here.
And this
I
took
don't know
place
where,
in-
but
End of October, beginning of November 2019.
Yes.
When they talk about taking the kids to Disneyland, do you know which kids they were referencing?
It was Chad's children.
Did they ever mention taking any of Lori's children with them?
No, I had the impression that she was an empty nester, and I assumed the daughter was older that had passed, from a disease or cancer or something that I assumed she didn't have any other children.
Did Chad or Lori provide you any details as to how Lori's daughter died?
No, and I did not ask.
And Your Honor, I'm just looking at the time, and now may be a good time to take a break in testimony for the lunch hour.
Okay, appreciate that, Ms. Blake. We will go ahead and take the noon lunch hour. We'll take the hour and be back on for additional testimony at 1 o'clock.
All right, please.
Okay. So, interesting day at the Chad Daybell trial. So far, we heard from the pathologist who told us there were bruises in Tammy's body and that she has died of a homicide through asphyxiation. Now, the defense attorney tried to dismantle that and ask him, how could somebody strangle, asphyxiate the victim at the same time, causing her bruises on this arm and that arm? So I don't know what the jury is going to think about that. I thought it was a very impactful testimony from the pathologist. And now we are hearing from Chad Daybell's neighbor who knew his wife, Tammy Daybell, before she passed. And right after she passed, 7 days later, Chad went to dinner at her house and told them that he found his next wife, the woman he was going to marry, Lori Vallow, and that when she was present with the newly in love couple, that they seemed very affectionate towards each other, and she had never seen Chad like that before with his previous wife, Tammy. So this story it just keeps untangling and untangling, and I don't know still how Chad thought that he was in power for so long, that he could manipulate people for so long, because he's just so stupid. I mean, the things that he does to speak ill of his wife at her funeral, to leave bruises in her body, and then to also get married 7 days later. It's very sus, bro. It's very sus. So this is a baby who woke up. Hi, everybody. I'm Whisper. And we're going to get out of here and we're going to continue on the trial marathon later. I'll see everybody later. Thank you for watching. And I'm trying to get Whisper to not step all over the keyboard. And I'll see you next time. Thank you. Whisper.